We already went over the first charge in the special counsel's most recent indictment of Donald Trump. That's the most important charge to understand since the others are built upon that one, so go back and watch that video if you haven't already. The second and third counts are 18 U.S. Code 1512C22 and 1512K, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. The first is defined in the legal code as, quote, whoever corruptly otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so, end quote, and the second is defined in the legal code as, quote, whoever conspires to commit any offense under this section, end quote. Essentially, the latter is the crime of conspiring with others to do the former. These became laws as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, a bipartisan bill passed by the 107th Congress and signed by President George W. Bush in response to the Enron scandal. Similar to the first charge, this law was also used by special counsel Robert Mueller in his investigation of interference in the 2016 election, this time used against Trump associate Roger Stone for obstructing and conspiring to obstruct a congressional investigation. Stone was found guilty. However, he was later pardoned by Trump, a precedent Trump hopes to now benefit from should he or one of his allies become president in the next election, assuming, of course, that Joe Biden doesn't more successfully follow Trump's example if he loses. Recently, this charge has gained more public exposure for its prolific use in prosecuting over 70 participants in the January 6 U.S. Capitol attack, particularly when the defendants were part of one of the domestic terrorist groups who planned to attack the Capitol prior to the event. However, in the case of this indictment against Donald Trump, the charge goes beyond the events on January 6th. The official proceeding the indictment alleges Donald Trump to have attempted to and conspired to attempt to obstruct is the collection, counting, and certifying of the results of the election. We discussed the ways in which he attempted to do so in the previous video, but to recap, these include using, quote, knowingly false claims of election fraud to get state legislators and election officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change electoral votes for Joe Biden to electoral votes for Trump, organizing fraudulent slate of electors, attempting to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations, falsely claiming that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election outcome, attempting to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results, end quote, and finally, exploiting the January 6th attack on the Capitol to, quote, levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress to further delay the certification based on those claims, end quote. So the prosecution's theory for the case regarding these two charges is pretty straightforward. The collection, certification, and counting of the results of the election are official proceedings which Donald Trump attempted to and conspired to attempt to obstruct in the aforementioned ways. The fourth and final count is 18 U.S. Code 241, conspiracy against rights, which is, quote, if two or more persons conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person in any state, territory, commonwealth, possession, or district in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution or laws of the United States, or because of his having exercised the same, end quote. Paraphrased, conspiracy against rights makes it illegal to conspire to violate a right or privilege granted to someone by the Constitution or federal law. In the case of this indictment, the, quote, right to vote and have one's vote counted, end quote. Conspiracy against rights was initially signed into law as part of the Enforcement Act of 1870, which was passed to give the executive branch the authority to enforce the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the government, federal or state, from interfering with the right to vote, quote, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, end quote. This was meant to curb efforts to prevent formerly enslaved people from voting in the wake of the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of those formerly enslaved people, also known as the Reconstruction era. Later in the early 1900s and again in the late 40s, the law was revised to what it is today, which is a protection against the deprivation of federal rights and privileges in general. This law was recently in the news when it was used to convict right-wing social media influencer Douglas Mackey. A grand jury voted to indict Mackey after federal prosecutors presented an investigation into Mackey's attempts to misinform voters on how to vote. Prosecutors successfully demonstrated that Mackey sought to impede voters' right to vote by deceiving them into voting in illegitimate ways. Similar to Trump's defense today, Mackey argued that he was engaging in speech protected by the First Amendment. However, the jury disagreed. This indictment argues that a primary function of Trump's various conspiracies was to validate legitimate votes, unlawfully preventing those votes from being counted to change the outcome of the election, thus depriving those voters the right to vote and have their votes counted. Common in the comments of the videos in this series has been the contention that Trump should have been charged with insurrection and/or sedition in addition to these charges, but after reading the indictment, I support the special counsel refrained from doing so. Keep in mind that conviction requires a unanimous decision by the jury. Each charge added to an indictment is an opportunity for the defense to create reasonable doubt, which is easier for some charges than others. Convince a juror that reasonable doubt exists for one charge, and it becomes that much easier to convince that juror that reasonable doubt exists for the other charges, since the seed of doubt has already been planted. Any way I look at it, it would have been more difficult to unanimously convince a jury that these conspiracies amounted to insurrection or sedition, primarily because those terms colloquially have such different connotations than the charges brought, whereas these charges are exceedingly straightforward. That doesn't mean that I don't personally think what Trump did constitutes insurrection or sedition, but given how concurrent sentencing works in the United States justice system, I acknowledge that both charges would have presented more risk without necessarily bringing additional incremental justice. After reviewing the indictment in its entirety, it's pretty hard to argue that Trump wasn't conspiring to overturn the election. The prosecutors have limited the charges to that accusation and provided themselves multiple paths to proving it, which seems like a pretty smart strategy. After all, each juror doesn't need to buy every conspiracy proposed by the prosecutors. They each only need to buy one. Most people defending Trump don't even claim that he wasn't trying to overturn the election. Instead, they tend to argue that Trump was justified in trying to overturn the election, or that his attempts were lawful or were protected under the First Amendment. I think that's what it will come down to on the jury as well, whether any jurors think Trump's behavior was reasonably justifiable. But what do you think? Should Trump's attempts to alter the outcome of the election be allowable? Do those attempts constitute a conspiracy against rights? How would you view these charges if you were on the jury? Would you be more or less convinced of the special counsel's case had they included insurrection or sedition charges? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back soon to dive deeper into the evidence presented by the special counsel in this indictment.